What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the episode of the Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joey Mayalari. So today's episode is going to be a lot of baseball, but then we're going to mix in some football at the end. We're going to start off with one of the hottest hitters in the game of baseball in the second half, and that is Nick Kurtz. Since the All-Star break, he leads the MLB in OPS with an 1128 OPS. And yes, 1128, 1.128 OPS, adding in a 330 batting average as well, fifth best in the majors. He was second best in isolated power so far to this point. A 360 isolated power is very impressive. That basically takes what your slugging percentage is and subtracts your batting average from your slugging to give you the isolated power number. And then also, he is number one in the second half in weighted runs created plus with 204. Overall this season, he's hit 35 home runs, 12th in the MLB, despite playing 40 less games than the rest of the guys above him. Adding in a 293 batting average, very impressive as well, which is 13th best in the MLB, and a 172 weighted runs created plus total, which is number 2 in the MLB. He's also tied for the second best OPS overall this season, with Shohei Ohtani with a 1010 OPS on the year. Very, very impressive season. I know he didn't have enough at-bats to necessarily qualify, with some of these other hitters, but if you take basically what his total plate appearances is on the year, and you basically rank every MLB player with that minimum being the amount of plate appearances that he's had, he has the second best OPS in the game of baseball, which is very, very impressive. So shout out Nick Kurtz. Just want to start out the episode talking about him since he's a future MVP in this league, an absolute terror at the plate, and definitely a great building block for that A's team for the future. Now moving on to the Cleveland Guardians. What they've done in the second half of the season is amazing. Over a 13-day window, they made up 9.5 games on the Detroit Tigers. They were 9.5 games back in the division behind Detroit and are now tied heading into the last series of the season. Entering July 9th, this Guardians team was fourth in the division. They were 13 games above the Chicago White Sox for the last spot in the AL Central, and they were 15.5 games back of the top spot in the AL Central at that point, which was held by the Detroit Tigers. So at one point, on July 9th, they were closer in the standings to the Chicago White Sox than they were the Detroit Tigers. At that point, the Guardians were 42 and 48. They were 5.5 games back of the wild card spot. And I remember telling my boss, Matt, at the time, when he was very upset with the way they were playing, I remember looking at their schedule in the second half, and I remember thinking this schedule is not only very favorable with a bottom three opponent win percentage heading in, to what they would face in the second half, but also they always find a way every single year to surprise you. Once they get into the playoffs, they are always the team nobody wants to face in October. So I had faith that this team would figure things out and be a playoff team. I kept that faith alive and believed every step of the way that they'd make the playoffs. I told them consistently for the last 2.5 months that they would make it in. I kept my optimism because, as I said, this Guardians team is always a team that gets hot at the right time, and they're always the club no one wants to face in October. We'll see how things work out. They still have some work to do this weekend, but they're in a position to make the playoffs after, at one point, being 15.5 games back of the Detroit Tigers. To be where they're at right now is very, very impressive. This is a historic run. They're 17-3 over the last 20 games, which is tied for the best in the MLB with Seattle. 22-8 over the last 30, which is tied with the Yankees for the best in the MLB over the last 30 games. They allowed just 234 runs in the second half of the season in 64 games, which is second best in the MLB to the Dodgers. They are 40-24 in the second half, which is the second best in the MLB, just a half game back of Milwaukee for the lead. 40 wins, 24 losses. Very, very impressive second half. They allowed only 58 runs so far in September, which is the best in the MLB by 17 runs. They're allowing just 2.41 runs per game, which just shows their pitching is excellent. Credit to Gavin Williams. He has been their ace, and he's really picked up in the second half. He is tied for third in the MLB with the best ERA in the second half of the season. He's tied with Tarik Skubal, who is right now the favorite and probably the guy that will win the AL Cy Young Award winner. Gavin Williams is tied with him for the third best ERA in baseball in the second half of the season, a 2.18 ERA. Also adding in, Williams had a 9.98 strikeouts per 9 innings in the second half, which was 12th best in the MLB so far in the second half. Also adding in 8 quality starts in the second half, tied for 5th, and 7 wins in the second half, which is tied for 4th. On the year, Williams is 12-5 with a 3.06 ERA, 13th best in the MLB on the season. I told my boss in April that I thought Williams had electric stuff. He looked really good in some of the moments in the preseason from what I saw, and he showed some spurts over the last couple of years that really showed what his potential could be. He has been one of the best pitchers in baseball over the last few months. It definitely deserves more recognition. Another guy that doesn't get talked about enough on that Cleveland team is Jose Ramirez. He has been one of the best players in the game of baseball for the last 5 years or so, and he's definitely got some recognition, but not to the level he deserves, especially this season. This is a second straight 30 home run, 40 stolen base season. He currently leads the MLB in stolen bases with 40 on the year, also adding in 101 runs scored, 11th best in the game of baseball. He's also tied for 24th in home runs with 30 on the season, and also is 8th in wins above replacement with 6.2 on the year, and he's 10th in the MLB with an 869 OPS. Very, very impressive season for him. I'm rooting for Cleveland to make it into playoffs, but obviously, as I said, they still have some work to do. So heading into the final 3-game series of the MLB regular season, the wild card of both the AL and the NL still has a lot of things that have to be figured out. In the AL, the Blue Jays hold a narrow lead through a tiebreak over the Yankees for the AL East Division lead. Currently, the Yankees have the top wild card spot, but if they could win one more game than the Jays do this weekend, they would win the division. The Red Sox hold the second wild card spot and are one game up on Detroit, who holds the last wild card spot, and the Red Sox are playing Detroit for a 3-game set at Fenway. Houston is 1 game back of Detroit and 2 games back of the Red Sox. The Red Sox magic number is 1 game. They need to win 1 game or have Houston lose 1 game in order to clinch a wild card spot. Currently, the Guardians are first in the AL Central through a tiebreaker with Detroit. Obviously a big weekend for Cleveland and also Detroit. Detroit had a big meltdown in the second half. They really struggled in September for sure. 2-8 in the last 10, 6-14 in the last 20 games, and 10-20 in the last 30 games. And then when you look in the NL, the Mets own the last wild card spot currently and are 1 game above Cincinnati and 2 games above Arizona. So that'll be an exciting weekend to see who ends up getting that last spot. The Mets have a 3-game set in Miami, while the Reds will be playing the Brewers for 3 games in Milwaukee, and Arizona has a 3-game set in San Diego. The Mets have had a historic meltdown in the second half. They are 27-35 since the All-Star break, which is 20th in the MLB, 7-13 in the last 20 games, and 13-17 in the last 30. But they are playing a little bit better as of late. They're giving themselves a chance to still make it in, even with all of those struggles. If they make it in, I'm sure they'll be a team no one necessarily wants to play, even though they've been struggling. They have a talented roster. And then another team that I think if they make it in could make some noise is the Cincinnati Reds, which they'd have a tough matchup with the way things stand. They would be playing, if they were to sneak in and get that last wildcard spot, they'd be facing the Dodgers, which would be a tough matchup. But this Reds team has the pitching to make a run. It should be a really interesting weekend in the NL along with the AL. My prediction is that the Mets will still get that last wildcard spot, but we'll obviously have to see what happens. Now switching over to the NFL really quick. Going to talk about the Colts and the New York Giants. We'll start off with the Colts. Had a big win last week in Week 3 over the Tennessee Titans, 41-20. Daniel Jones has been on an absolute tear to start the season. He has been a star to begin the year, throwing for 272 passing yards per game through 3 weeks, with 816 total passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 0 interceptions. Also add in a 111.7 passer rating, which is 3rd best in the NFL through 3 weeks. He's been running the ball really well, too. 3 rushing touchdowns on the season. Also adding in a 71.5% completion percentage, which is very impressive. Last week against Tennessee, he threw for 228 yards, had a passing touchdown, and also added in 27 yards on the ground. Per CBS Sports, DJ is the only quarterback in the last 75 years, that's as far as their stats book would go. But in the last 75 years, he's the only quarterback through the first 3 weeks to be 3-0 with a 70% completion percentage, have 850 total yards, 6 total touchdowns, and 0 turnovers. Very, very impressive beginning of the season for Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones this year became just the 2nd quarterback ever through the first 3 games of the season to open the year 3-0 with 9+ yards per pass attempt and 0 turnovers. And that's for a quarterback that went 3-0 with a minimum of 75 throws. And that's per a tweet from First Sports. So 2025 Daniel Jones and 2018 Patrick Mahomes are the only quarterbacks ever to open a season 3-0 with 9+ yards per pass attempt, which is very impressive. and also no turnovers. That's very, very impressive. 3-0, 9+ yards per attempt, and no turnovers. So Daniel Jones is having a great start to the year, which these stats can show. But when you're watching him play as well, he's just so much more calm, cool, collected when the pressure's coming and he knows the blitz is coming. He's just stepping up, making big-time throws, and just playing fearlessly, not thinking about not trying to turn the ball over and not trying to force a throw. Daniel Jones is just playing fearlessly and just playing the way he should be playing. The Giants never really gave him the confidence they should have, and they didn't really surround him enough. But you can see now with Daniel Jones in Indianapolis, he's playing a lot more comfortably. And obviously, that system they have set up is surrounding Daniel Jones with the pieces that he needs to succeed. And you can see that when you're watching him play. I mean, 9.3 yards per pass attempt is very, very impressive. That's very impressive. And it's also the highest in the NFL through 3 weeks. Add in 71.6% for completion percentage. That's third best in the NFL. That's a very, very efficient start to the year in both of those stat categories. And also, like I said, when you're watching him play, he's a lot more comfortable against the blitz. And there are stats that back that up. And this is a stat from Pro Football Focus and also was tweeted by Will Bowling on Twitter. Under pressure in 2025, Daniel Jones is 12 of 20 with a 60% completion percentage and also averaging 7.5 yards per attempt. While in 2024, he was only 47 of 106 under pressure with a 44% completion percentage and was averaging 4.7 yards per attempt. When blitzed in 2025, Daniel Jones is 30 of 44 passing, 68% completion percentage, 10 yards per attempt, and then you compare that to 2024, he was 63 of 109, a 58% completion percentage, and was averaging 5.5 yards per attempt. After week 3, right now, Daniel Jones is leading the NFL in expected points added per dropback, also in yards per attempt, and also the best in the NFL against the blitz right now. And those stats back it up. You can see a lot of progress and a lot of potential in Daniel Jones' game when you're watching him play in Indianapolis. And he's already shown that he has the potential. And now you're seeing that really come to be each and every snap he's getting in Indianapolis. He's just playing comfortably, and that's helped them win 3 games so far. They're 3-0 with a plus 47 point differential. 103 points for the first 3 games of the season is the most in Colts history. The Colts are the only team in the NFL since 1940 to have 0 turnovers and 1 punt or less over a 3-game span. They're also averaging 34.3 points per game, which is second best in the NFL right now, and also averaging 418.7 yards per game, which is second best in the league. I've stayed with Daniel Jones every single step of the way since his rookie year, through all the ups and downs. I always knew he had the potential and always had this in him, and I would always defend him tooth and nail because I always knew the Giants did not support him enough. And all of this brings into question whether or not the Giants have the right leadership in place to help the team succeed. Daniel Jones is 3-0 and having a career-best start to a season after leaving the Giants. Saquon Barkley last year left the Giants and won Offensive Player of the Year and also won the Super Bowl. Xavier McKinney last season left the Giants and ended up leading the NFL in interceptions with Green Bay in 2024. Then you also add in Leonard Williams and Julian Love, left the Giants over the last few seasons, with Leonard Williams being traded, but the rest of those guys all leaving in free agency. Besides Daniel Jones, he was cut by the Giants. But Leonard Williams and Julian Love left the Giants, went to Seattle, and they both had Pro Bowl seasons after leaving New York. Chris the Entertainer, who's a big Giants fan and he has a YouTube page, he's right. The Giants have an organizational problem. If all of these people leave and they have better seasons after they leave New York, that's concerning. And like I said after week 1, if you want to win, you either leave the Giants or play against the Giants. Because now you can see players are not put in a position to succeed when they're playing in New York. They all somehow have, for the most part, which I'm sure there are players that have struggled after leaving the Giants, but for the most part, I just gave a good amount of examples right there of guys that left the Giants and played better after leaving the Giants. And some of these guys were already good on the New York Giants, but they even went up another level when they left the Giants, like Saquon Barkley winning Offensive Player of the Year, like Xavier McKinney leading the NFL in interceptions last year. And those are 2 guys the Giants decided to let walk in free agency for free, and that's really tough. And I think at the end of the day, letting Saquon walk was probably the right decision. Paying a running back when you don't have a good offensive line and you're kind of rebuilding, it didn't really make much sense to pay Saquon Barkley. So obviously it was a tough decision. And obviously seeing him go to the Philadelphia Eagles and win a Super Bowl is really tough for John Mara and the Giants executive board. I would understand it's probably not the easiest thing to see. But at the same time, paying your running back during a rebuild probably wouldn't have been the best decision. So I don't think it was the worst decision to let him walk. But letting Saquon walk, letting McKinney walk, letting Love walk, all for free without getting anything back in return is just really difficult. Especially when these guys are leaving and they're having better seasons than they did with the New York Giants. And these are guys that were good players when they were in New York and showed a lot of potential, but they got even better when they left. And that's concerning. That means the Giants aren't developing talent and not surrounding these guys with the right support staff and the right coaching and the right players around them. And that's a problem. They need to do, obviously, a lot better with developing some of this talent because guys can't just leave and play better when they leave the Giants. It's not just coincidence when it's 5 or 6 players that I just mentioned. It's concerning when all of those guys left and played a lot better. And Daniel Jones being the biggest example. Everyone gave up on Daniel Jones. Besides me and a few other people, including my dad, most people gave up on Daniel Jones. But my dad and I stayed with him every step of the way because we believed that at the end of the day, the Giants just did not surround him as well as they should have. And now you can see that. The Colts have just found a way to surround him a lot better than the Giants did. And I know we're only 3 games into the season, so it's not like Daniel Jones is the MVP right now, and they're already handing him the award for the season. And I know a lot could change over the course of an NFL season, but through the first 3 weeks, he has looked awesome. So while I'm talking about the Giants, I do want to mention they're making the switch from Russell Wilson to Jaxson Dart at quarterback heading into Week 4. After a really tough Sunday Night Football performance for Russell Wilson versus the Chiefs, the Giants are making the jump to Jaxson Dart. Russ seemed to just walk into pressure at times in this game on Sunday night. Even when he had a clean pocket, he would flood the pocket and then end up rolling out and find himself in more pressure for just no reason. And he was inaccurate in the red zone, giving the Giants no competitive chance to really score in their last trip to the red zone to end the game, including 2 throws that went way out of bounds. He just didn't have it in that game on Sunday. I know he played really well against Dallas in Week 2, but I think that really shows more that Dallas' defense is going to be really weak this year. If Russell Wilson and the Giants were able to put up that many points and Wilson threw for 450 yards and had 3 deep touchdown passes against them, I think that shows more about their secondary and their defense than it showed about Russell Wilson. Wilson obviously is past his prime, and I think the Giants realized they're 0-3. Brian Daboll and Joe Shane are fighting for their jobs right now. Jaxson Dart showed a lot of promise in the preseason, and I think they said, let's make the jump to Dart now while we're 0-3. If we can win a couple games and string together a few wins, maybe we could potentially, get a lot of momentum heading into the second half of the season, and then you never know what's going to happen. But being 0-3 to start the season is not a great look for the Giants, but just seems like every single year they're 0-2 and 0-3 to begin the year. I do like Jaxson Dart a lot. I think he is the future quarterback for the New York Giants. I have a lot of faith in him. I was a fan of him in the draft process. I was a fan of him last year at Ole Miss. And I'm happy he's a New York Giant. I do think he's going to do really well for this team. But at the same time, I do know this offensive line is not playing great football right now, even though there's been some signs of potential with Andrew Thomas being back. That's definitely a confidence booster for the rest of the guys around him on the offensive line. But there's definitely somewhat of a concern knowing that the Giants just aren't getting enough potential out of some of these guys. And I just gave examples of guys that have left the Giants and played better. So hopefully with Jaxson Dart, the Giants are able to surround him, which obviously right now, the guys they have around him are what they're going to have for this season. But hopefully in the offseason, they really do address that offensive line and really fix it. And I don't know if it'll be Joe Shane and Brian Daboll. Right now, the way things stand, I think they'll both be out, and they won't be the GM of the Giants after the season's over with. We'll see what happens. If this season keeps going awry, John Mara could make a shift even sooner than the end of the season. I am very confident in Jaxson Dart, though. I think he's the future franchise quarterback for the New York Giants. But obviously, like I said, they need to be able to surround this guy with more talent, especially in the offensive line. He needs more help in the offensive line. Russell Wilson needed more help in the offensive line. Even though Russ did struggle passing the ball, the offensive line really didn't do him too many favors over the first 3 games of the season. And then the same thing with Daniel Jones over the last 6 seasons, heading into this year. The Giants' offensive line just really didn't help him out enough as much as they should have. And at the end of the day, that comes down to Joe Shane for the most part and Brian Daboll not being able to identify the right guys in free agency in the draft and also not developing guys, as well as they probably should have. But obviously, at the end of the day, they did take some chances. Evan Neal was a miss, unfortunately, it looks like. I know he tried to make the shift to be a god, but that really hasn't seemed to work, it seems like, since he's been a healthy scratch, I believe, for all 3 games this season. But like I mentioned, this team needs to be better at developing talent. We'll see what happens, though, in this game in Week 4. Anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys are good on. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.